The morning Maggie Garrison stagecoach was due to roll into Cottonwood Bend, Wyoming territory. Abel Slater knelt in the cold dirt behind his barn with a shovel in his hands, digging up his dead wife's wedding dress. The soil had gone hard with the last frost of April 1878, and each strike of the spade rang out like a struck bell across the quiet ranch yard. Abel worked with his jaw set, sweat beading beneath his hat despite the chill, and he did not stop until the blade caught cloth instead of earth. He knelt then, brushing away 3 years of dirt with his bare hands, uncovering the oilcloth bundle he had wrapped so carefully on the worst night of his life. His fingers trembled as he lifted it free, and for a long moment he simply held it against his chest, the weight of it far heavier than mere fabric had any right to be. He had buried it here on a September evening in 1875, 2 days after he had buried Rebecca herself in the small cemetery plot beneath the cottonwoods that gave the town its name. He had not been able to bear the sight of her wedding dress hanging in the cedar chest, could not stand to open the lid and see the ivory silk folded just as she had folded it the morning after their wedding, still smelling faintly of the lavender water she used to press into the seams. So he had wrapped it in oilcloth, walked out behind the barn in the dark, and dug a hole with his own hands, weeping the whole while, and put it into the ground as though it, too, needed burying. Now, 3 years later, with a new bride arriving on the noon stage, Abel Slater had decided it was time Rebecca's dress found its proper rest beside her, in the cemetery where it belonged, and not hidden behind a barn like something shameful. He would not start a new marriage with his first wife's memory buried in secret dirt. He owed Rebecca that much respect, and he owed the woman who was coming to marry him an honest house, free of things kept from her. He carried the bundle to the small family cemetery at the edge of his land, where a modest wooden cross marked Rebecca Ann Slater, beloved wife, 1852 to 1875, and beside it a smaller stone for the infant son who had not lived past his first hour. Abel dug a new, shallow grave beside her headstone, laid the oilcloth bundle gently into the earth, and stood over it with his hat in his hands. "I am not forgetting you," he said quietly to the wind. "I could never forget you, Rebecca, but I cannot keep living like a man already in the ground himself. You would not have wanted that for me, and you would not have wanted it for the boy if he had lived to see me this way. I am going to try again. I hope you understand." He filled the grave, tamped the earth flat, and set a small stone atop it, and then he stood a long while in the cold spring wind before turning back toward the house, because there was a bride coming on the noon stage, and a man could not keep a lady waiting at the depot no matter how heavy his heart. Maggie Garrison had left Ohio 3 weeks earlier with a single trunk, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a folded letter from a rancher named Abel Slater that she had read so many times the creases had begun to tear. She was 26 years old, unmarried, and had spent the last 2 years watching her family's small farm outside Zanesville slide slowly into ruin after her father's death left them with debts none of them had known existed. Her brother Thomas had gone west first, to Nebraska, seeking work on the railroad, and it was through a cousin's letter that Maggie had first heard of the matrimonial advertisements that ranchers and homesteaders placed in papers back east, seeking wives to share their lives and labor in a land still raw and unbroken. She had answered 3 advertisements before Abel Slater's. The first man had wanted a housekeeper more than a wife and had said as much plainly, without apology. The second had not written back at all after her first reply, and she never learned why. The third had frightened her with the coldness of his letters, the way he spoke of a wife as a thing to be acquired like a plow horse or a good rifle. But Abel Slater's letters had been different from the first line. He had written of his ranch along the Laramie Plains, of the mountains that turned purple at dusk, of the creek that ran behind his house and froze thick enough to skate on some winters. He had written, too, with a plainness that struck her as honest rather than cold, that he had been married once before, that his wife had died bringing their son into the world, and that both mother and child now rested on his land. He had not tried to hide this from her, as she suspected another man might have, fearing it would frighten off a prospective bride. Instead, he had written, "I tell you this not to trouble you, Miss Garrison, but because I believe a marriage built on honesty, even painful honesty, stands a better chance than one built on pretty lies. I do not expect you to replace what I lost. I only hope, in time, we might build something new together, something that is entirely its own." Maggie had read that line so many times she could recite it without looking, and something in those words had settled a fear in her that she had not even realized she carried, the fear of being asked to become a ghost's understudy. Abel Slater did not want a copy of his first wife. He wanted, he said, a woman willing to build a life beside him. That was a different thing entirely, and it was that difference which had finally moved her hand to write back yes. The stagecoach that carried her the last leg of her journey from the rail depot in Laramie to Cottonwood Bend rattled and swayed over a road that seemed to Maggie only half a road at all, more a suggestion of one, cut through sagebrush and rock with the great gray shoulders of the mountains rising to the west. She shared the coach with a drummer selling patent medicines and an older woman traveling to see her married daughter, and by the time the driver called out that Cottonwood Bend lay just ahead, Maggie's back ached and her stomach had turned itself into a hard knot of nerves. She smoothed her traveling dress, a sensible dove-gray wool that had seen better days, and touched the small cameo brooch at her collar that had belonged to her mother, as though touching it might lend her courage. Through the coach window she saw a scattering of wooden buildings, a church with a modest steeple, a general store, a livery, and beyond them the endless roll of grassland running toward the mountains. It was nothing like Ohio. It was, she thought, both more frightening and more beautiful than she had imagined, and she was not entirely sure which feeling was stronger. The coach rolled to a stop in front of the depot office, and Maggie stepped down into a wind that smelled of dust and sage, and something green she could not name, some scent of the high plains grass she had never encountered before. She stood a moment blinking in the bright noon light, one hand shading her eyes, searching the small crowd gathered near the depot for a face that might belong to the man whose letters she had memorized. She saw him before he saw her. A tall man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a clean but well-worn brown coat and a hat pushed back from his forehead, standing beside a wagon with 2 horses harnessed and waiting. His face was weathered by sun and work, a face that might have been called hard if not for something gentle around the eyes, something that looked, to Maggie, like a man who had known sorrow and had not let it turn him to stone. He was younger than she had feared and older than she had hoped, somewhere in his middle 30s, she guessed, with dark hair showing beneath his hat and a jaw shadowed with a day's growth of beard. "Miss Garrison," he said, coming forward, removing his hat as he approached, which she found she appreciated more than she expected to. "I am Abel Slater." "Mr. Slater," she said, and found her voice steadier than her heart. "I am very glad to finally meet you." He looked at her for a long moment, and something crossed his face that she could not quite name, some flicker of surprise or perhaps relief, as though he had feared she would be different than her letters and was glad to find she was not. "You made good time," he said. "The roads can be hard this time of year with the frost coming out of the ground." "I did not mind it," Maggie said, which was not entirely true but seemed the polite thing to say. "I confess I am glad to be standing on solid ground again." He almost smiled at that, she thought, the corner of his mouth twitching before he caught himself, and he gestured toward the wagon. "May I take your trunk? Reverend Whitfield is expecting us within the hour, if that suits you." I did not want to presume on the timing, but the roads home take near 2 hours, and I thought it best to have the ceremony done before we make the drive, so you would not need to travel twice. Maggie's stomach turned over at the mention of the ceremony, sooner than she had quite prepared herself to face it, though of course she had known it would come quickly. Mail-order arrangements were not courtships measured in months. They were practical matters, settled quickly for practical reasons, and she had known this when she boarded the train in Ohio. Still standing here in the dust of an unfamiliar town, looking at the solid, quiet stranger who was to become her husband within the hour, she felt the full weight of what she had agreed to for the first time. "That suits me," she said, because it was the truth, even if her hands had gone cold inside her gloves. The church was a plain wooden building with a small bell tower, and Reverend Elias Whitfield turned out to be an older man with kind eyes and a soft voice, who greeted Maggie warmly and did not make her feel, as she had feared some clergymen might, that she was doing something faintly scandalous by marrying a man she had known only through letters. "The Lord has brought many good marriages out of far stranger beginnings than a letter and a train ticket," the Reverend told her with a smile as he gathered his prayer book. "I have married a dozen such couples in this territory, Miss Garrison, and most of them are among the happiest folks I know." The ceremony itself was brief, attended only by the Reverend's wife as witness, and a ranch hand of Abel's named Silas Petty, a lean young man of perhaps 22 with a shock of red hair and an easy grin, who had ridden into town that morning to fetch supplies and been pressed into service as a second witness. Maggie stood beside Abel Slater in the small church, sunlight falling through the plain glass windows, and repeated vows to a man she had known for less than an hour in person, though she felt, strangely, that she already knew something true about him from the months of letters that had passed between them. When Reverend Whitfield pronounced them married, Abel turned to her, and for a moment neither of them moved, both suddenly aware that a kiss was expected, was proper, was even necessary to seal the thing they had just done. He leaned down and kissed her briefly and gently, his lips barely brushing hers, and when he drew back she saw color rise in his weathered face, saw that he was as uncertain in this moment as she was, and something in that shared uncertainty eased the tightness in her chest. "Well," said Silas Petty cheerfully, clapping his hat back onto his head, "I reckon that makes you Mrs. Slater now, ma'am. Welcome to the territory." "Thank you, Mr. Petty," Maggie said, and found she could smile after all. They signed the church register, and Reverend Whitfield's wife, a plump, cheerful woman named Dorothy, insisted on giving Maggie a small bouquet of dried larkspur she had pressed the previous summer, tied with a bit of ribbon. "For luck," Dorothy said, pressing it into Maggie's hands, "and because every bride ought to carry something, even out here where the flowers are slow to come." The drive out to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours, the wagon rattling over a rutted track that ran along a creek lined with willow and cottonwood, the mountains growing larger and more detailed as they went, until Maggie could make out individual ridges and patches of snow still clinging to the highest peaks. Abel spoke little during the drive, pointing out landmarks in a quiet, steady voice, the boundary of his land marked by a line of fence posts, a bend in the creek where the trout ran thick in summer, a rise of hill from which, he said, you could see clear to the next county on a clear day. "It is beautiful country," Maggie said, and meant it, though it was also lonelier country than any she had known, the horizon stretching so wide and empty in places that it made her chest ache with something she could not quite name, a mixture of awe and a small, private fear of how far she now was from everything she had ever known. "It can be hard country, too," Abel said, glancing sideways at her. "I would not want you to think I painted you a false picture in my letters. The winters here are long, and they are not gentle. We lose stock some years to the cold, and the isolation wears on folks who are not prepared for it. I want you to know that plainly, now that you have seen it with your own eyes, in case it changes anything in your mind." "It does not change anything," Maggie said, and was surprised by how certain her own voice sounded. "I did not come west expecting an easy life, Mr. Slater. I came expecting a different one. I believe I can bear hard if it is honest." He looked at her then for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and said only, "I am glad to hear it. before turning his attention back to the road, but Maggie thought she saw something ease in his shoulders, some tension she had not noticed until it loosened. The ranch house, when they arrived, was a solid two-story building of hewn logs and whitewashed clapboard, larger than Maggie had expected, with a wide porch facing west toward the mountains and a barn and several outbuildings arranged around a well-kept yard. Smoke rose from the chimney, and as the wagon rolled to a stop, the front door opened and a stout older woman came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. "This is Ruth Combs," Abel said, helping Maggie down from the wagon seat. "She has kept my house since before, for a good many years now. She lives with her husband Henry on the next section over, but she comes to cook and keep things in order most days. Ruth, this is my wife, Mrs. Maggie Slater." The words "my wife" struck Maggie strangely, a title she had not yet grown accustomed to wearing, and she saw Ruth Combs's sharp eyes take her in from bonnet to boot with an assessing look that was not unkind exactly, but was not warm either, not yet. "Mrs. Slater," Ruth said with a small nod. "Welcome to Cottonwood Bend. I have supper started, and I have aired out the bedroom upstairs, though I expect you will want to arrange things your own way soon enough." "Thank you, Mrs. Combs," Maggie said. "I am grateful for your kindness in preparing the house." Ruth's expression flickered at that, something passing behind her eyes too quick for Maggie to read, and then she turned back toward the house without further comment, and Maggie was left standing in the yard beside her new husband, holding a bouquet of dried larkspur, looking up at the house that was now, somehow, hers. That first evening passed in a haze of small, unfamiliar tasks, learning where things were kept in the kitchen, meeting Henry Combs when he came by to fetch his wife home, eating a quiet supper of beef stew and cornbread across the table from a man who was now her husband but who remained, in so many ways, a stranger. Abel was courteous, careful with his words, refilling her coffee cup without being asked, but there was a reserve in him that Maggie could not quite name, a wall behind his eyes that his letters had not fully prepared her for. It was only when she went upstairs that first night, carrying a lamp Abel had lit for her, that she understood, at least in part, what that reserve might mean. The bedroom Ruth had prepared for her was clean and comfortable, a quilt in blues and creams spread neatly over the bed, a washstand with a pitcher and basin set beside the window. But on the dresser sat a small framed photograph, faded but clear enough, of a young woman in a high-necked dress, dark hair pinned up simply, a solemn, gentle face looking out from the frame with eyes that seemed, to Maggie, both kind and sad. She did not need to ask who it was. She understood, standing there with the lamp trembling slightly in her hand, that she was looking at Rebecca Slater, the first wife, the one who had died bringing a son into the world who had not lived to draw his second breath. She set the lamp down and sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, looking at that photograph, feeling something complicated stir in her chest, not quite jealousy, not quite fear, but some tangled cousin of both. She thought of Abel's letter, the one that had convinced her to come at all. "I do not expect you to replace what I lost. I only hope, in time, we might build something new together." She had believed those words when she read them in Ohio, sitting at her mother's old writing desk with the autumn light slanting through the window. She wanted, still, to believe them now. But it was one thing to read of a dead wife in a letter, and quite another to sleep in a room that still held her photograph, in a house that had been her house first, married to a man who had loved her first, and who had not yet spoken her name aloud to Maggie even once. Maggie did not know, that first night, about the dress buried and dug up again that very morning. She did not know how close Abel had come, only hours before her arrival, to laying his grief formally to rest beside Rebecca's grave. She knew only the photograph, the quiet reserve, the sense of walking into a house that still belonged, in some essential way, to someone else. She blew out the lamp and lay a long while in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her, the wind against the eaves, a horse stamping somewhere in the barn, and eventually, Exhausted from the long journey, she slept. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm of their own, the kind of rhythm that frontier life demanded of anyone who wished to survive it. Maggie rose before dawn to help Ruth Combs with the cooking and the endless washing, learned to milk the 2 dairy cows Abel kept, learned to bake bread in the heavy iron stove that Ruth insisted required a different hand than the ovens back east. She learned the names of the ranch hands, Silas Petty and an older man called Dutch who had worked for Abel since before Rebecca's time, and a quiet young Arapaho man named Charging Bear who came by twice a week to trade fresh-caught fish and help with the horses, whose family had lived on this land long before any fences had been strung across it, before the treaties that had pushed his people onto ever-shrinking reservations to the north. It was Charging Bear, in fact, who first spoke plainly to Maggie of Rebecca, in a way no one else on the ranch had yet dared. "She was good to my mother," he told Maggie one afternoon, as they stood together watching him work a burr out of a gelding's mane, his English careful and precise, learned at a mission school he spoke of with neither warmth nor bitterness, simply as a fact of his life. "My mother was sick 2 winters before Mrs. Slater died. Rebecca Slater brought her medicine from town, sat with her at night. Abel Slater did not forbid it, though some ranchers around here would not have let their wives near an Indian woman's sickbed. He is not like some of the others." Maggie considered this. "What was she like? Rebecca, I mean, if you do not mind my asking." Charging Bear looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing whether the question came from simple curiosity or something more painful. "She laughed easily," he said finally. "She was not afraid of hard work, though she came from a town in Missouri and had not grown up on a ranch. She wanted children very much. It was a great sorrow to everyone here when she and the boy died together. Abel Slater was not the same man for a long while after." "And now?" Maggie asked before she quite meant to. Charging Bear's dark eyes rested on her with something like understanding. "Now you are here," he said simply, and went back to his work, leaving Maggie to turn the words over in her mind for the rest of the afternoon. It was around the 4th week of her marriage that Maggie first learned of the dress, and it came about, as such things often do, through no intention on anyone's part. She had gone walking one evening after supper, following the creek path out toward the small stand of cottonwoods at the eastern edge of the property, seeking a little solitude after a long day of scrubbing floors and boiling laundry. And she came, without quite meaning to, upon the small fenced cemetery where Rebecca Slater and her infant son were buried. She had known of its existence, had glimpsed the white wooden cross from a distance once or twice, but had never come close enough to read the words carved into the headstones until that evening, with the sun sinking gold and orange behind the mountains, and the first chill of night beginning to creep across the grass. She stood at the little gate for a long moment before entering, feeling as though she were trespassing on something private, and then pushed through anyway, drawn by a need she could not fully articulate to understand the woman whose photograph still sat, weeks later, in the drawer where Maggie had finally moved it, unable to bring herself to either display it or throw it away. Rebecca Ann Slater, beloved wife, 1852 to 1875, the larger cross read, and beside it, smaller, a stone that simply said, "Our son, born and returned to God the same hour, September 3, 1875. Maggie stood reading those words with tears unexpectedly rising in her throat, moved by a grief that was not her own but that touched something in her nonetheless, some universal ache of loss that any woman might feel standing before a mother and child buried together. It was then that she noticed the small, disturbed patch of earth beside the headstone, freshly turned, not yet fully settled, with a plain stone marker laid atop it that bore no words at all. She knelt and touched the earth, puzzled, and it was in that posture, kneeling in the cemetery grass with the sunset staining the sky behind her, that Ruth Combs found her a few minutes later, having come looking for Maggie when she failed to return from her walk. "That is where he buried the dress," Ruth said quietly, coming to stand beside her, and there was something gentler in her voice than Maggie had yet heard from the older woman, some crack in the reserve she had maintained since Maggie's arrival. "The dress?" Maggie asked, rising, brushing dirt from her skirt. Ruth's face was solemn in the fading light. "Her wedding dress. After Rebecca died, Abel could not bear to have it in the house. He would not sell it, would not give it away, could not burn it, I think, though I sometimes wondered if he thought of it. Instead, he buried it behind the barn, wrapped in oilcloth, the night after her funeral. I do not think he ever told anyone but me, and I only knew because I found the shovel in the disturbed ground the next morning and asked him plain, and he told me the truth, because Abel Slater is not a man who lies easily, even about things that shame him." Maggie felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And now he has moved it here. He dug it up the very morning you arrived," Ruth said. "I saw him at it myself from my kitchen window before I came over to help with the house. I did not ask him why that day, because I had my hands full getting things ready for you, but I expect I know the reason well enough. A man cannot build a new house atop an old, unsettled foundation, Mrs. Slater. I believe he wanted to lay that grief properly to rest, in its rightful place beside her, before he brought you into this home." Maggie stood silent for a long moment, looking down at the small, disturbed patch of earth, and felt a strange mixture of emotions move through her, a kind of grief for a woman she had never known, a flicker of unease at the secrecy of it, and beneath all of that, something warmer and more complicated, a dawning understanding of the depth of feeling that lay behind Abel Slater's quiet, careful reserve. "He never told me," she said finally. "No," Ruth agreed. "I do not imagine it is an easy thing for a man like Abel to speak of. He carries his grief the way some men carry an old wound, tender to the touch long after it has healed over. But I will tell you this, Mrs. Slater, because I think you ought to hear it from someone, and it might as well be me. In 4 weeks I have watched you work this house and this land without complaint, and I have watched Abel Slater's face when he does not think anyone is looking, and I have seen something in him these past weeks that was not there before you came. I do not say this to press you toward feelings you are not ready to claim. I only say it because an old woman notices things, and I thought you ought to know that whatever ghost lives in this house, it does not seem to be standing between the two of you as much as you might fear." Maggie walked back to the house that evening, turning Ruth's words over and over in her mind. And that night, when Abel came in from the barn later than usual, smelling of hay and horse and the cold night air, she found herself watching him across the supper table with new eyes, seeing not merely the quiet, careful stranger she had married 4 weeks before, but a man who had knelt alone in the dark that very morning, digging up his dead wife's wedding dress with his bare hands, so that he might offer his new bride a house unburdened by secrets. She did not speak of it that night, but something had shifted in her, some understanding taking root that would grow, over the weeks that followed, into something she had not expected to find so quickly in a marriage begun by letter and sealed within an hour of meeting. Spring gave way slowly to early summer on the ranch, and with it came the hard, unglamorous work of calving season, of mending fences torn down by winter storms, of planting the small kitchen garden that Maggie insisted on establishing despite Ruth's skepticism about the soil. Maggie found, to her own surprise, that she took to ranch life with more ease than she had expected, that her hands grew strong and calloused in ways her mother would scarcely have recognized, that she could ride passably well within a month and competently within 2, taught patiently by Silas Petty, who treated her with the easy, brotherly affection of a young man who had decided early on that his employer's new wife was a fine and sensible woman deserving of respect. Abel, for his part, remained careful and courteous, but the careful reserve she had noticed that first night began, slowly, to thaw. She caught him watching her sometimes across the supper table, an expression on his face she could not quite name, something between wonder and worry, as though he were still working out what to make of the fact that she had come to stay. He began to speak more in the evenings of small things, the price of cattle in Cheyenne, a letter from his brother in Missouri, a hawk he had watched hunting rabbits along the creek that afternoon, and though these were small confidences, Maggie treasured each one as a sign of the wall between them lowering by degrees. It was in early June, during a violent thunderstorm that rolled down off the mountains with a suddenness that caught the whole ranch by surprise, that something between them shifted decisively. The storm broke just after supper, lightning cracking across a sky that had been clear blue an hour before, and within minutes the wind had risen to a howl that rattled the shutters and sent the chickens scrambling for the coop. Abel was out at the barn checking on the horses when the first hard rain hit, and Maggie, watching from the kitchen window with her heart in her throat, saw a bolt of lightning strike something near the edge of the hayfield, saw a lick of orange flame spring up despite the driving rain, catching in the dry stubble left from the spring cutting. Fire! She shouted, though there was no one in the house to hear her but Ruth, who had stayed late that evening on account of the weather, and the two women ran out into the storm together, grabbing what buckets and wet sacks they could find, racing toward the field where the flames, whipped by the wind, were already spreading faster than seemed possible in the rain. Abel came running from the barn, shouting for Silas and Dutch, and for a chaotic quarter of an hour the small group beat at the flames with wet sacks and shovels of dirt, the rain helping them even as the wind fought against them, until at last the fire guttered and died, leaving a blackened scar across perhaps an acre of the hayfield but sparing the barn, the house, and the horses that had been Abel's first concern. In the aftermath, soaked to the skin and shaking with exertion and cold, Maggie found herself standing beside Abel at the edge of the ruined field, both of them staring at the smoking, rain-soaked ground, and it was only then, in the strange calm after the danger had passed, that he turned to her and took her face in his hands, streaked with soot and rain, and looked at her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "You could have been hurt," he said, his voice rough. "Running out into that with the lightning still striking. I saw you from the barn and my heart nearly stopped in my chest." "I could not simply watch the fire spread and do nothing," Maggie said, though her own voice trembled now, whether from cold or from the nearness of him she could not have said. "No," Abel said softly. "I do not suppose you could. It is not in your nature to stand by while something you care for burns." He paused, and something in his expression grew more vulnerable, more exposed than she had yet seen it. "Maggie, I need to tell you something, and I should have told you weeks ago, and I am ashamed that I did not." "About the dress," she said quietly. "Ruth told me some weeks back. I have been waiting for you to speak of it yourself when you were ready." He looked startled and then slowly relieved. "You knew, and you said nothing." "I did not think it was mine to raise," Maggie said. "Some griefs need to be spoken in their own time, Abel, not dragged out before a person is ready." He was silent a long moment, rain still dripping from the brim of his hat, and then he said, "I buried that dress the night after her funeral because I could not bear to have it in the house, could not bear to be reminded, every time I opened that cedar chest, of everything I had lost. I told myself I was doing it out of respect for her memory, but I think now I was doing it because I was a coward, Maggie. I could not face my own grief head-on, so I put it in the ground and pretended that was the same as making peace with it. And the morning I arrived," Maggie asked. "I dug it up," he said, "and I moved it to lie beside her in the cemetery where it belonged all along. I could not marry you with that secret buried behind my barn like something shameful. I wanted to start our marriage honestly, even if I was not yet brave enough to tell you the whole of it myself." He shook his head, rain running down his weathered face. "I have been a poor sort of husband to you these past weeks, Maggie, careful and closed off, when you deserved a man willing to open his whole heart to you from the start." "You have not been poor," Maggie said, reaching up to touch his face, her hand as unsteady as his had been. "You have been grieving, Abel. There is no shame in that. I did not come here expecting a man with no past, no sorrows, no ghosts. I came here hoping to build something new beside a man honest enough to carry his grief without letting it curdle into cruelty or coldness. You have never once been cruel to me. You have been careful and quiet, and I understand now why. That is not the same as poor. Abel's throat worked, and for a moment Maggie thought he might weep, standing there in the rain with the smell of scorched grass still hanging in the air around them. I did not expect to feel this way again, he said finally, his voice barely audible over the last patter of rain. I told myself, when I wrote to you, that I was looking for a partner, a companion to share the work and the loneliness of this land. I did not let myself hope for more than that, because I thought that part of my heart had gone into the ground with Rebecca and the boy. But these past weeks, watching you take to this place, watching you run into a burning field without a second thought for your own safety, watching you be patient with Ruth's sharp tongue and kind to Charging Bear when some folks around here would not extend an Indian family that same courtesy, I have felt something waking in me that I thought was long buried. Abel, Maggie whispered. I love you, he said, the words rough and unpracticed, as though he had not said them aloud in years and had forgotten the shape of them in his mouth. I did not plan to fall in love with you, Maggie Garrison. I only hoped we might build a decent life together, out of practicality and mutual respect. But somewhere in these past weeks, respect turned into something a great deal larger, and I find myself loving you not as a replacement for anything I lost, but as something entirely new and entirely yours. Maggie felt tears rise, mixing with the rain already on her face, and she did not try to hide them. I love you too, she said. I did not expect to either. I came here frightened and lonely, carrying nothing but a trunk and a letter I had read so many times I nearly wore through the paper. But you have given me more than a roof and a name, Abel. You have given me a life I did not know I wanted until I was living it. I love you, and I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it because it is expected of a wife. I say it because it is true. He kissed her then properly, not the brief, uncertain kiss they had shared in the church weeks before, but something deeper and more certain, his hands cradling her rain-wet face as though she were the most precious thing he had ever held. And Maggie kissed him back with all the love she had been quietly gathering for him through 4 weeks of small kindnesses and careful courtesies. And around them the last of the storm rolled off toward the mountains, leaving the scorched field steaming faintly in the cool night air. And neither of them noticed the cold any more at all. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and Ruth Combs, watching from the kitchen doorway with a knowing look on her weathered face, said nothing beyond, "There is coffee on the stove and dry clothes laid out. I expect you will both want them," before retreating to give them privacy, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth that she did not bother to hide. The weeks after the storm brought a new ease between them, a warmth that had been building slowly and now flowed freely, no longer dammed behind careful reserve. Abel began speaking more often of Rebecca, not as a secret to be guarded, but as a part of his history that Maggie was welcome to know. And Maggie found, to her own surprise, that she could listen to these stories without the jealous ache she had feared, because Abel spoke of Rebecca now with a gentle fondness rather than the raw wound of before, and it was clear to Maggie that loving her did not require him to stop having loved Rebecca first. The two loves lived in him side by side, one a chapter finished and honored, the other a new chapter still being written, and Maggie found peace in understanding that distinction. It was in early July that trouble came to Cottonwood Bend in a form neither of them had anticipated, in the shape of a man named Elias Thorne, who owned the largest ranch in the county and who had, Maggie learned from Ruth's careful gossip, once hoped to court Rebecca himself before she chose Abel, and who had watched Abel's second marriage unfold with an interest that went beyond simple neighborly curiosity. Thorne came to call on a Sunday afternoon, ostensibly to discuss the boundary fence between his land and Abel's, but Maggie noticed, from the moment he removed his hat and bowed over her hand with an old-fashioned courtesy that felt performative rather than genuine, that his true purpose lay elsewhere. He was a handsome man in a hard-edged way, perhaps 40 years old, with silver threading through dark hair and an easy, confident manner that Maggie found herself instinctively distrusting. "Mrs. Slater," he said, his eyes lingering on her a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, "Abel is a fortunate man." I had heard tales in town of the schoolteacher he'd brought west, but tales do not do you justice. "I was not a schoolteacher, Mr. Thorne," Maggie said evenly, "though I thank you for the compliment, however it was intended." Something flickered in Thorne's eyes, amusement perhaps, or reassessment, and he turned his attention to Abel with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "I only meant to say, Abel, that you have done well for yourself twice over now. Rebecca was a fine woman, and it seems you have found another." Abel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained level. "I would ask you not to speak of my first wife so casually, Elias. She deserves better than to be mentioned in passing while you look over my second." Thorne raised his hands in mock surrender, though his smile did not waver. "No offense meant, Abel, none at all. I simply admire a man who finds good fortune not once but twice." He turned back to Maggie. "If you ever find ranch life out here too lonely, Mrs. Slater, my own wife, passed some years back, and my house has felt a great deal too quiet since. I have more hands and more land than Abel here, and a woman of your evident quality would find herself wanting for nothing under my roof." The insinuation hung in the air, brazen enough that even Abel's careful composure cracked, color rising in his weathered face, and Maggie saw his hands curl into fists at his sides. But before he could speak, Maggie herself answered, her voice cool and clear. "Mr. Thorne, I did not travel 2,000 miles by rail and coach to trade one arrangement for another based on the size of a man's landholdings. I married Abel Slater because I have come to love him, and because he has proven himself, in the months I have known him, to be a man of honesty and depth of feeling that I doubt you could match if you tried for a lifetime. I will thank you to keep such offers to yourself in future, and to remember that this is my home now, and I intend to defend it and the man who shares it with me from anyone who would disrespect either." A long, tense silence followed, and then unexpectedly Thorne laughed, a short, surprised sound. "Well," he said, settling his hat back onto his head, "I see I was mistaken in my assessment of the situation, Mrs. Slater. I withdraw the offer, and I offer my apologies, sincerely given, for the disrespect. You are a formidable woman, and Abel is a fortunate man twice over, it seems, in more ways than land and cattle." He nodded to them both. "The fence line can wait for another day. Good afternoon to you." He rode off, and Abel turned to Maggie with an expression somewhere between astonishment and pride. "I have never seen Elias Thorne put in his place so thoroughly," he said. "I confess I do not know whether to be alarmed or grateful that I married a woman capable of that." "Be grateful," Maggie said, still flushed with the heat of her own indignation. "I did not care for the way he looked at me, or the way he spoke of Rebecca. Some men mistake widowhood and remarriage for weakness, Abel. I wanted him to understand plainly that he was mistaken." Abel pulled her into his arms right there in the yard, laughing now, something light and free in the sound that Maggie had not heard from him before. "I love you," he said. "I do not think I have ever loved anyone the way I love you, Maggie Slater, and I do not say that to diminish what I felt for Rebecca. I say it because what I feel for you is entirely its own thing, built new from the ground up, exactly as I hoped it might be when I sat down to write that first letter to a stranger in Ohio." Summer deepened, and with it their marriage deepened too, moving past the careful courtesies of strangers into something that felt, to Maggie, like the genuine partnership she had once only hoped for in her most private dreams. She learned Abel's moods, the way he grew quiet and thoughtful near the anniversary of Rebecca's death in early September, and she learned to give him space during those days without taking his silence personally, understanding now that grief had its seasons, and that loving a man who had loved before meant making room for those seasons rather than resenting them. When September came, and the anniversary of Rebecca and the infant's death arrived, Abel asked Maggie if she would walk with him to the cemetery, and she agreed without hesitation. They stood together before the two small graves in the newer, unmarked patch of earth where the wedding dress now rested, and Abel spoke aloud, for the first time in Maggie's hearing, words that seemed addressed as much to himself as to the dead. "Rebecca," he said, "I want you to know that I have not forgotten you, and I never will. But I have found a good woman, someone who honors your memory rather than resenting it, and who has helped me become, I think, a better man than I was even when you knew me. I hope, wherever you are, that brings you some peace, because it has certainly brought peace to me." Maggie squeezed his hand, and together they stood a while longer in the golden September light, the mountains beginning to show the first dusting of early snow on their highest peaks, and when they finally turned to walk back toward the house, Maggie felt that some final door had quietly closed, not in sorrow, but in gentle, complete acceptance, leaving space for whatever came next in both their lives. What came next, as it happened, was a child. Maggie discovered she was pregnant in early October, confirmed by the doctor who rode out from town at Ruth's insistence, and when she told Abel the news, sitting across from him at the supper table on a cold evening with the first real frost of autumn silvering the windows, she watched joy and fear war visibly across his face. Joy at the prospect of the child, fear rooted in memory of what childbirth had cost him before. "I will not lose you the way I lost her," he said, his voice tight with an old terror he had not fully voiced until that moment. "Maggie, I could not survive that grief twice." "You will not lose me," Maggie said, though she understood she could not promise such a thing with absolute certainty. No one could, not in a territory where doctors were scarce and childbirth remained dangerous even for the healthiest of women. "But I will not live in fear either, Abel. We will take every precaution. Ruth has delivered a dozen babies in this county and lost none of the mothers. Dr. Ashford is competent, and the town is close enough if trouble comes. I refuse to spend the next months of my life afraid of a thing that has not yet happened, and I would ask you to try to do the same, for both our sakes and the baby's." Abel nodded slowly, and though the fear did not entirely leave his eyes over the following months, he channeled it instead into careful preparation, insisting Ruth stay at the house more frequently as Maggie's time drew nearer, sending Silas into town every few weeks to confirm Dr. Ashford's availability, building, with his own hands over the long winter evenings, a sturdy oak cradle that he sanded and oiled until it gleamed by lamplight. The winter of 1878 into 1879 proved harder than most, with heavy snows that closed the roads for weeks at a stretch. But the ranch held firm, well provisioned and well managed, and Maggie found a strange contentment in those long snowbound evenings, sitting by the fire with Abel, watching him carve small wooden toys for the child that was coming, listening to him tell stories of his own boyhood in Missouri, learning every remaining corner of the man she had married. The baby came in late March, during a spring storm not unlike the one that had first drawn Abel's confession from him the previous June, though this storm brought snow rather than fire, thick, wet flakes that piled against the windows as Maggie labored through a long night with Ruth Combs at her side and Dr. Ashford, fortunately already in the area tending another patient, arriving just in time to assist with the final difficult hour. Abel paced the hallway outside the bedroom door for what felt to him like an eternity, Silas and Dutch keeping him company with quiet words and strong coffee, and when at last Ruth opened the door, her face tired but wreathed in a wide smile, and told him he had a son, healthy and loud-voiced and perfectly whole, Abel wept openly for the first time in years, tears of relief and joy mixing freely on his weathered face. He named the boy Rebecca had wanted a girl's name ready. He confessed to Maggie later, but had never chosen a boy's name in all her months of waiting. And so this child, this healthy, squalling boy with a shock of dark hair, became simply Thomas Slater, named for Maggie's own brother out in Nebraska, a fresh name for a fresh beginning, unburdened by the weight of the past. Maggie held her son for the first time as the storm outside began finally to ease, watching Abel's face as he looked down at the child with an expression of wonder, so profound it seemed to erase, for that moment at least, every hard year that had come before it. "He is perfect," Abel whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one careful finger. "Maggie, thank you. Thank you for everything you have given me, more than I ever dared hope to receive again." "We gave this to each other," Maggie said softly, exhaustion and joy mingling in her voice. "This is ours, Abel. Entirely new, entirely ours, just as you promised in that very first letter." 2 years later, in the spring of 1881, a daughter followed, whom they named Ruth in honor of the woman who had become, by then, as much a grandmother to their children as any blood relation could have been, having stood beside Maggie through both births with the same steady, capable hands. The ranch prospered under Abel and Maggie's shared management, growing to include a larger herd and additional acreage purchased, ironically, from Elias Thorne himself, who had mellowed considerably over the years, and had become, if not a close friend, at least a respectful and occasionally welcome neighbor, having eventually married a widow from Cheyenne and settled into a contentment of his own. Charging Bear remained a frequent presence on the ranch, and it was he who taught young Thomas Slater to fish the creek and track deer through the cottonwoods as the boy grew, and Abel made certain, in the years that followed, to speak plainly to his children of the injustices done to Charging Bear's people, the broken treaties and stolen lands that had shaped the very ground their ranch stood upon, wanting his son and daughter to grow up understanding the true cost of the country they called home, rather than the comfortable myths some of their neighbors preferred to tell. On the 5th anniversary of Maggie's arrival in Cottonwood Bend, Abel took her walking out to the small family cemetery, now expanded to include a proper stone marker over the spot where Rebecca's wedding dress lay buried beside her, a marker Abel had commissioned from a stonecutter in Laramie, engraved simply in loving memory, that her sacrifice and her spirit be honored always. Beside it he had left space, quietly and without discussion, for himself and for Maggie someday, so that all three of them in the fullness of time might rest together on the land they had each, in their own turn and their own way, helped to build. "I used to think," Abel said, standing there with Maggie's hand in his, their 2 children playing nearby among the cottonwoods, chasing each other with the boundless energy of the very young, "that burying that dress was the hardest thing I would ever have to do. Digging it up again, the morning you arrived, felt harder still, because it meant admitting to myself that I was ready to move forward, ready to risk loving again after everything grief had taught me to fear." "And now?" Maggie asked, leaning into his shoulder as the late afternoon sun slanted golden through the trees. "Now I think it was the wisest thing I ever did," Abel said. "Not the burying and not even the digging up. The wisest thing was answering honestly when you asked, all those months ago in your very first letter, what sort of man I truly was. I could have written you pretty lies, Maggie, could have hidden Rebecca and the boy entirely, pretended I was a man with no history at all. But I told you the truth, and you came anyway, and everything good that has happened to us since has grown out of that single choice to be honest, even when honesty felt like the harder road." Maggie looked up at him, at the lines the years and the weather had etched into his face, at the steady warmth in his eyes that had replaced, so gradually she had barely noticed the change happening, the careful reserve of that first evening at the depot, and she felt a gratitude so large it nearly stole her breath. "I am glad you told me the truth," she said. "I am glad you dug up that dress and laid it properly to rest before I ever set foot in your house. It taught me, before I even knew to look for the lesson, that you were a man capable of honoring the past without letting it own his future. That is a rare thing, Abel Slater, and I do not take it for granted, not for one single day." He kissed her then, softly, in the golden light with their children's laughter ringing through the cottonwoods and the mountains standing purple and eternal in the distance. And if Rebecca's spirit lingered anywhere near that quiet cemetery, watching the family that had grown from the ashes of her own too short life. Maggie liked to believe she would have approved, would have understood that love, once properly honored and properly grieved, does not close a door forever but simply, eventually, opens another one, wide enough for new joy to walk through. They lived many more years on that ranch together, weathering droughts and hard winters and the ordinary trials of frontier life, watching Thomas and Ruth grow into adulthood, watching the territory itself grow and change around them as Wyoming moved toward statehood, as railroads extended further across the plains, as the wild, untamed country of their early marriage gradually gave way to something more settled, though never entirely tame. But through every change, the foundation Abel and Maggie had built together remained steady, a marriage begun by careful letters and a hasty ceremony, deepened through honesty and shared hardship into something neither of them could have fully imagined on that first dusty afternoon at the Cottonwood Bend Depot, when a rancher who had buried his grief that very morning met the woman who would teach him, slowly and patiently, how to live again. And every September on the anniversary of Rebecca's death, and every April on the anniversary of their own wedding, Abel and Maggie walked together to that small cemetery beneath the cottonwoods, honoring both the woman who had come before and the love that had grown against all expectation in the wake of her loss, proof enough, if any were needed, that even in the hardest, most unforgiving corners of the frontier, the human heart could find its way, again and again, toward healing and toward home.